Story 1. I had always wanted to test myself against the wilderness, to disappear into the vast, untouched taiga and survive on my own. No phone, no GPS, just my rifle, my knife, and my instincts. The isolation was exhilarating at first. The silence, the endless stretches of towering pine, the sense that I was the only living soul for miles. But I was wrong. It started small. A feeling. A sense that I was being watched. I would pause while gutting a rabbit or chopping wood, my skin prickling with the unmistakable sensation of unseen eyes. I told myself it was nothing, just the paranoia of being alone in such an immense, untamed place. Then came the noises. The first night I heard rustling outside my tent. I grabbed my rifle and stepped out, expecting to see a fox or maybe a bear. But the forest was still, silent, unnaturally so. The usual nighttime sounds, the chirping of insects, the distant hoot of an owl, had vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into my bones. Nothing. I convinced myself it had been the wind. The second night, I heard it again. Only this time it wasn't rustling. It was breathing. Deep, slow inhalations just outside my tent flap. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The breathing stopped after a few moments, followed by the soft crunch of retreating footsteps. Something was out there, and it knew I was here. By the third night, I had built a fire as high as I could, desperate for light. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but the nearest sign of civilization was days away on foot. I forced myself to sit by the fire, rifle in my waiting. Then I heard it. Not footsteps this time. Not breathing. A howl, low and guttural, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It started deep, rising into a wailing, agonized cry that echoed through the trees. My blood turned to ice. It was close, too close. I raised my rifle, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. And that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just at the edge of the fire's glow. Its limbs were too long, its fingers tipped with curved, glistening claws. Its eyes caught the firelight, glowing like molten gold. It grinned. I fired. The shot rang through the trees, but the thing barely flinched. It tilted its head as if amused, and then in one fluid motion, it dropped to all fours and charged. I stumbled back, barely managing to chamber another round. I fired again. This time the bullet hit, tearing through flesh. But instead of falling, the thing laughed. A deep, guttural chuckle that made my stomach churn. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, moving impossibly fast, its claws tearing through the brush like knives. My lungs burned. My legs ached. I didn't know where I was running. I just knew I had to get away. Then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, pain exploding through my ribs. My rifle flew from my grip, landing somewhere in the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. Silence. I turned, chest heaving, scanning the trees. It was gone. No, not gone. Waiting. Then came the whisper, right next to my ear. I bolted. I don't remember how long I ran, only that the trees eventually thinned, the moonlight breaking through the canopy. Then, miraculously, I saw it. A cabin, old and crumbling, but shelter nonetheless. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The walls trembled as something heavy struck the wood. Then silence. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath. Had it left? Was it? The sound of creaking floorboards made my blood run cold. It was inside. Story 2. I had heard the stories before. Every hunter in these parts had. The old tales whispered around campfires of something lurking in the taiga, something that watched from the shadows. Some called it a spirit, others a beast. A few, the crazy ones, called it a werewolf. I never believed in that kind of thing. Not until the night it found me. I had been tracking a wounded elk for hours, its blood leaving a dark trail on the frozen ground. The sun had set and the temperature had plummeted. I should have turned back, but my hunger was stronger than my caution. My provisions were low, and I needed this kill. The trail led deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. A thick mist slithered between the trunks, wrapping around my boots as I walked. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no wind, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I found it. The elk lay in a clearing, its massive body twisted unnaturally. But something was wrong. Its stomach had been torn open, The ribcage split wide as if by enormous hands. The meat was untouched, the insides hollowed out as if something had eaten around the flesh. A chill crawled up my spine. No predator killed like this. Not wolves, not bears. Then I saw the footprints. Massive, deep impressions in the snow, far too large for any wolf. The claws dug deep, marking a bipedal gait, something that walked upright. A low growl rumbled through the trees. I spun around, rifle raised, scanning the darkness. The mist had thickened, swallowing the trees in a white shroud. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through my chest. Then, out of the fog, it stepped forward. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body a grotesque fusion of human and wolf. The fur was sparse, clinging in patches to gray, leathery skin. Its eyes burned with a sickly yellow glow, its mouth stretching into a snarl that revealed rows of jagged, uneven teeth. I fired. The shot echoed through the trees. The thing barely flinched. A slow, guttural laugh rumbled from its throat. Then it moved. Faster than anything I had ever seen, it lunged at me. I barely had time to throw myself aside before it crashed into the tree where I had been standing, splintering the bark. I scrambled to reload, but it was already on me, its claws raking across my jacket, tearing through the fabric like paper. I ran. Branches lashed at my face as I tore through the underbrush, my breath ragged. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, keeping pace with terrifying ease. My mind screamed at me to stop, to make a stand, but I knew better. I had seen its eyes. It wasn't just hunting me, it was playing with me. Then ahead of me, a cabin. Old, abandoned, but a sanctuary nonetheless. I didn't think. I just threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The wood shuddered as something massive struck it from the other side. Silence. I backed away, rifle raised, heart hammering against my ribs. My breath plumed in the freezing air. Then slowly, I heard it move. Not outside. Above me, the roof creaked under its weight. Dust drifted down from the rafters as something heavy shifted, claws scraping against the wood. I swallowed hard. I had only 2 bullets left. The thing let out a slow, rasping breath. Then a voice, deep, guttural, dripping with amusement. "Come out, little hunter." My blood turned to ice. I knew then I wasn't leaving this forest alive. Story 3. I had never feared the taiga before. It was my home. My father had taught me how to hunt, how to read the land, how to survive when the cold bit deep and the wind howled through the pines. But there are things in the taiga no man can prepare for. Things that watch from the shadows, things that hunger. It started with the tracks. I was 3 days into my hunting trip, deep in the wilderness, following the frozen river north. Snow had fallen the night before, blanketing the ground in a pristine white sheet. Perfect for tracking. I had been following a moose's trail when I saw them. Prints, massive and deep, running parallel to mine. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They were wrong. Too large for a wolf, too elongated for a bear. They looked almost like a man's footprints, but the toes were too long, tipped with deep claw marks. Worse still, they weren't fresh. They had been there before the snowfall. But that was impossible. If they had been made before the storm, they should have been covered. Instead, they remained crisp, untouched, as if the snow had refused to settle over them. A cold dread settled in my gut. I turned back toward my camp. That night, the howling began. I had built my fire high, the flames licking the darkness, casting flickering shadows on the trees. The wind had picked up, howling through the branches like a dying animal. At first, I thought it was just the storm. Then I heard something else. A low, guttural sound, rising into a wailing cry that seemed to stretch for miles. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. The howling stopped suddenly. Silence fell over the forest. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling just beyond the fire's glow. I gripped my rifle, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The footsteps stopped. The fire crackled. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Yellow and burning, scattered through the trees at different heights, as if whatever they belonged to was shifting, standing, crouching, moving in ways no living thing should move. A shape emerged from the darkness. It was tall, its body covered in patches of matted fur. Its arms were too long, its fingers tipped with black, curved claws. Its mouth, its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that glistened in the firelight. It grinned. The fire flared suddenly, and in that brief burst of light, I saw more of them. Many more. I didn't think. I ran. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the undergrowth, my boots sinking into the snow. The howling started again, closer this time, surrounding me. No matter which direction I turned, the sounds were there. Then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ribs. My rifle flew from my grip, landing somewhere in the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, gasping, my breath clouding in the frozen air. Silence. I turned, scanning the trees. The glowing eyes were gone. The forest was still. Then, just behind me, a whisper. "Why do you run?" A hand clawed skeletal, impossibly strong, closed around my shoulder, and I screamed. Story 4. I had spent most of my life in the wilderness. The taiga was my home, my sanctuary, a place where I felt more at ease than I ever had in the city. I had hunted here since I was a boy, first with my father, then alone. I knew its sounds, its rhythms, the way the trees whispered in the wind and the rivers sang under the ice. But I didn't know this. I didn't know what else lived in these woods. It started with the silence. On my fourth night out, the forest went dead. No wind, no rustling of branches, no distant hoot of an owl. It was as if the world had stopped breathing. My fire crackled weakly, its warmth doing little to push back the weight of the darkness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on skinning the hare I'd caught earlier. The meat was fresh, its blood steaming in the cold air. I worked in silence, the only sound the slow scrape of my knife. Then I smelled it. Rot. Thick and cloying, like meat left out in the sun for days. It crept into my lungs, burning the back of my throat. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. The hare's flesh had been cleaned. There was no reason for such a stench. And then I saw them. Footprints. Just beyond the fire's glow, half buried in the snow. Large, deep, leading toward my camp. But there were no prints leading away. I wasn't alone. Slowly I reached for my rifle, my fingers trembling against the stock. The silence pressed in around me. The fire sputtered as if struggling to stay alive. Then, movement. A shape shifting in the darkness. A figure standing at the edge of the firelight. I swallowed hard, raising my rifle. "Who's there?" My voice barely carried in the still air. The figure took a step forward. The firelight revealed a man, or at least, it looked like a man. His skin was stretched too tightly over his bones, his limbs too long, his fingers tipped with blackened, cracked nails. His mouth was wrong, too wide, the lips curling into a grin far beyond what should have been possible. And his eyes, burning yellow, locked onto me with something far beyond hunger. I fired. The bullet struck his chest. He barely reacted. A slow, rattling breath escaped his throat, his grin widening. Then with a sickening crack, he dropped to all fours, and he charged. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, my rifle falling from my hands. The thing was on me in an instant, its claws tearing through my coat, raking across my chest. Pain exploded through my ribs as I hit the ground. The fire flickered wildly. For a brief second, the flames grew bright, and I saw them. More figures, standing in the trees, watching, grinning. Then, as quickly as it had come, the fire died, and the darkness swallowed me whole. Story 5. I had always prided myself on knowing the taiga. The land was in my blood, passed down from my father and his father before him. I knew every sound, every track, every trick the forest could play. But there are things in the deep woods that no man can predict, things that do not belong. The first sign was the missing deer. I had been tracking a small herd for most of the morning, moving silently through the trees, my rifle at the ready. The snow was fresh, the tracks clear. Everything was as it should be. Then the trail stopped. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken branches. The hoofprints simply ended, as if the deer had been plucked from the earth without a trace. A bitter wind howled through the trees, making the branches groan. I adjusted my grip on my rifle and pressed on, trying to ignore the gnawing unease curling in my gut. By the time night fell, I had reached a small clearing and set up camp. The fire burned hot, pushing back the cold, but the unease remained. The silence was wrong, too deep, too empty. Then I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, carried on the wind. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It had come from the trees, just beyond the fire's reach. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast dark forest. No answer. Movement. A shadow shifted between the trees, too fast to be an animal, too fluid to be a man. I raised my rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the whisper came again. Closer. Why are you here? I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the fire. Just the empty woods. I was not alone. I stayed awake that night, rifle in my lap, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. The whispering continued, soft and insidious, slipping between the trees like a living thing. Then, just before dawn, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, its fingers ending in wicked curved claws. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the firelight stretched too tight over its bones. And its eyes were wrong. They glowed like embers, burning with something ancient and hungry. It grinned. A deep guttural laugh rumbled from its throat. Then, with a sickening crack, it dropped to all fours, and it ran at me. I fired. The shot rang through the trees. The thing staggered but did not fall. It laughed. I scrambled backward, barely managing to grab my pack before bolting into the forest. The wind screamed through the branches, the trees twisting and shifting around me. Behind me, the thing followed, not running, loping, moving with a terrifying, unnatural grace, its breath rasping in the freezing air. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. The world blurred around me, trees, snow, darkness. Then, a cabin, old and crumbling, half buried in the snow. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. For a long moment, nothing. Then a thump. The wood shuddered as something heavy struck it. Another thump, louder, closer. Then, just beyond the door, the whisper. Let me in. I pressed my back against the wood, heart hammering in my chest. The silence stretched on. Then, from the roof, the slow, deliberate scrape of claws. And the whisper came again. Let me in.